just listen to the Republicans.
Well, let's try to hear what happened.
Exercise. It's for Article 1.
Welcome to Lecture 11.1 about the legislative endgame. I don't really know why I decided to call this a fixation with the Avengers, who knows? But this is what happens after the House and Senate engage in internal discussions and debates about what should be in legislation, and then turn to deciding what the final version of that legislation will look like. Now, an important thing to remember is, and we'll come back and talk about this in the next lecture, about how votes unfold and what really influences legislators' votes on the floor. But there's really kind of two phases to this. There's an initial phase where the House and Senate pass versions of these bills. And remember, then they have to resolve those differences and figure out what of the House version of the bill and what of the Senate version of the bill should go into some final version of legislation. There is an interesting and challenging social dynamic that arises when two groups or two individuals have to decide what it is and coordinate their actions on what it is that they're going to do. They've got to arrive at a decision where they need to act together, and they both want to act together, but they disagree about what the best alternative to act together might be. So consider a game. This is just like the Prisoner's Dilemma, except this is a game that is, because it was named by economists, and economists I'm an associate professor of economics. I'm proudly an associate professor of economics. I have an appointment in the econ department, and I'll tell you what, there's a lot of dudes in economics, and so when they initially named this game, they called it the Battle of the Sexes, and the idea was you've got a man and a woman who are dating, and they can't decide what they want to do. So we've got to relabel these things in ways that are less offensive. And so instead of a man and a woman, we're going to have gender neutral player 1 and player 2. And these are two friends who are hanging out at their apartment, and trying to figure out where they're going to go get some dinner. And it's a Friday night, and they say, we're going to go get some burgers. One friend has to go do something after they get dinner, so they decide to go in separate cars. Once they get in the car, in their separate cars, they have to figure out where it is they're going to go to dinner. And it turns out that, this game was conceived of prior to the advent of cell phones. One person's cell phone is dead, say, and they can't communicate about where it is that they're going to end up. But they know this. So they know that they get a higher payoff. You can see the payoff here. They get a higher payoff from being at the same restaurant, so either going to Five Guys or to Wendy's, than they do from one person ending up at Five Guys and the other person ending up at Wendy's, which is this off diagonal. So they want to end up at the same restaurant. They want to both choose to be at Five Guys, or they want to both choose to be at Wendy's. Now, there's an interesting dynamic here as well, where one person, player 1's payoffs are here in this first position. He prefers Five Guys, while relatively speaking, player 2 doesn't like Five Guys as much as player 1. But when they're at Wendy's, the reverse is true. Player 2 really likes the spicy chicken sandwich at Wendy's, and doesn't like spending as much money as you have to spend at Five Guys. And so he prefers being at Wendy's relative to what player 1 feels like. And they know that there's this dynamic. Okay. So they know that one person likes one more than the other. The question is then, how do we solve this game and figure out what it is that they're going to do? Well, it turns out that there are a couple of equilibria in this game. One is that they both choose to go to Five Guys. Remember, they're not communicating. They're making these decisions independently, and they coordinate on going to Five Guys. But it turns out that that's not the only equilibrium. There's another equilibrium where they both choose to go to Wendy's. Now, to see why that's the case, let's think through what happens if player 1 knows that player 2 is going to Five Guys. So, for example, he just says, there is no way that I will go to Wendy's. Player 2 says that. Says, listen, I know you love Five Guys. Let's go to Five Guys. So he rules out this column, this Wendy's column. So then player 1, even though he doesn't have a cell phone and no way of communicating after the fact, but he knows that player 2 is going to be at Five Guys, he would never go to Wendy's because he's choosing between 10 and 0, and he prefers 10 to 0 because 10 is better than 0. Think of this as just a happiness quotient of being at Five Guys. Now, on the other hand, if player 1 knows that there's no way that player 2 would ever go to Five Guys, we can just rule out this column. Instead, player 1, whoa, look at that. I highlighted the wrong number. Player 1 is going to choose 5 over 0. 5 over 0 is more preferred, is bigger, so that's where he'll end up. So we can do this in reverse. Then where player 2 knows for some reason that player 1 would never go to Wendy's, and if he would never go to Wendy's, he knows that Five Guys is better because 5 is bigger than 0. And then here where I changed the colors of the numbers in the wrong order, but the dynamic is the same, where he's choosing, if player 1 is never going to go to Five Guys, he's only going to go to Wendy's. Player 2 then is choosing between 0 and 10, and he would choose that, right? So here we go. The Nash equilibria, I'll go back and highlight the Nash equilibria, are these two squares where they both end up at Five Guys or they both end up at Wendy's. Now, it turns out you can come back for a game theory class from Professor Magleby at some point in the future. It turns out that there's another way to solve this game in what are called mixed strategies, and where they mix, that is that they randomly select between one or the other. That's beyond the scope of this class. For the purposes of this class, it's clear, though, there are two Nash equilibria. If they both know that they're going to be at Five Guys, no one has an incentive to unilaterally deviate here, right? So if this is where we are, player 1 doesn't want to shift down to Wendy's, and player 2 doesn't want to shift to Wendy's. They want to stay at Five Guys and hang out together. On the other hand, if they're both at Wendy's, neither one wants to unilaterally deviate, right? So 5 is better than 0 and 10 is better than 0. We're going to stay at Wendy's. So Nash equilibria, this notion of equilibrium exists where no one has an incentive to unilaterally deviate. I hold constant what everyone else is doing, and it's clear that if I hold constant what they're doing, I don't want to do anything differently than what I'm doing right now. And in some ways, we construct these stories about how we arrive at this point. But what's more important is that once we're at that point, more important than these stories, is that arriving at that point, we have no incentive to do anything differently. Okay, so we've gone through and we've solved this. And now, what if we just relabeled this? And we called it instead the Battle of Chambers, as in chambers in the House of the Chamber of the House of Representatives and the Senate chamber. We've got these two groups of legislators, the House and the Senate. The House prefers the House bill to the Senate bill, and the Senate prefers the Senate bill to the House bill, but they both prefer some bill, the House bill or the Senate bill, to no bill at all. The question is, what do they do, and how do they get there, and how do they resolve this and coordinate on policy that both chambers could possibly agree to? And that's going to be a large part of what we talk about today, trying to figure out how the House and Senate coordinate and what are the mechanisms by which they use and rely on to coordinate and figure out what legislation is going to move forward from the legislative process in the House and Senate. They've both negotiated internally. They've gone through these procedures that give them a House bill, go through these procedures that arrive at a Senate bill. They're different in some way, in large part because the procedures in the House and the Senate are themselves different. How do you coordinate then and figure out what's going to be the final version of the law? Because the Constitution requires that for a bill to become law, it has to be passed in identical form in the House and Senate. So how do we negotiate this? That's the topic for the balance of today. That's a big question that we're going to try and answer as we move forward. The House and Senate have lots of mechanisms for coordinating decisions on what policies they'll choose between the House version of policies and the Senate version of policies, or perhaps something somewhere in between. So when we resolve House and Senate differences, there are a few ways that the chambers engage in this negotiation. Sometimes they go through what's called straight passage, where the House passes a version, the Senate takes that version, passes exactly that version, and that's what becomes law. They send that to the president for the president's signature. There's also something they call a ping pong approach. In comparative politics, where there's bicameralism, they call it a navette, which is a shuttle. A navette is a shuttle in a loom that goes back and forth. We call it ping ponging in American politics, where you start off with one version and the other side slaps it back, and it goes back and forth until they settle on a version that they both can accept. Then, this ping pong approach is limited by amendments and the amendment tree. So both the House and the Senate have limits on the number of amendments you can offer. So you can offer amendments in the nature of a substitute, and then you can perfect that, but you can't offer a second amendment or a third degree amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute. You get one shot at that, and so, or two shots at it. You can amend it, then you can do another one, but you can't do a third amendment in the nature of a substitute. You can only do so many perfecting amendments as well. And so this ping-ponging approach is subject to that limitation. So one way that they get around this is they go through a process called a conference committee. And they try and reach an agreement within the context of a conference committee. Conference committees are used for important bills. This is the conventional wisdom on which chambers have significant differences. Differences that would be hard to resolve in this kind of less efficient ping-ponging back and forth. This bargaining can be very intense and high profile. So knowing that there's a House version, a high-profile House, and a high-profile Senate version, we have a conference committee. The people who serve on this conference committee, where there are members of the House and members of the Senate who are brought together to negotiate differences between the House and Senate. This negotiation is usually pretty intense. There's also an understanding that there's a role for the president, right? So he's looking at this negotiation and trying to say which kinds of compromises would make this bill acceptable or less acceptable for him. And so even though the formal negotiation is between members of the House and Senate, they're certainly thinking about that last phase of the legislative game where the president may or may not veto what they do. And then there's some question about how public these negotiations actually are. For a lot of congressional history, the conference committee process was one that was largely done in secret, behind closed doors. Things went into the conference and came out, and people didn't really know how those compromises were generated. There were a series of reforms in the 1970s where the conference was brought out into the public, and they had to hold public meetings. It's unclear, though, that how meaningful those public meetings are. So they're forced to have those public meetings, but frequently the negotiation is still happening informally, not necessarily in a meeting of the conference committee, but in phone calls between legislators and their staff. It's good to see what one of these looks like in the wild. This is a negotiation for, I believe this is the ACA. I need to double check my notes. So you can see arrayed here on the right-hand side, our right-hand side of the table, are the House negotiators. This is Henry Waxman. This is a guy from Wisconsin named David Obey. And you can see dramatically in front of, and then on the other side, you have Daniel Inouye and Dick Lugar, other prominent Democrats and Republicans. Chuck Grassley is here, and they're squared off. They're on either side of the table. You can see they've got press and staff all around them, and they've got big stacks of paper dramatically piled in front of them. This is the Senate version. This is the House version of the bill. And what they're going to do in this meeting is go through this legislation and figure out what from the Senate version and what from the House version is going to make it into the final passage of the bill, what's going to be in the actual law that gets passed by Congress and signed by the president. Now, it's unrealistic that Daniel Inouye and David Obey actually intend to flip through every page of, the House bill and the Senate bill. This is a photo op, as many of these public hearings of conference committees tend to be. It's a very symbolic gesture. Most of the negotiation is actually happening This guy's got his phone out. He's a staffer on the Senate. And somewhere over here, you can see who's looking at their phones, as they're the ones that are actually negotiating back and forth about what their bosses want to do. And they're the ones that are actually going to go through and strike language. David Obey and Daniel Inouye. Daniel Inouye was from Hawaii. David Obey's from Wisconsin. They've got other things that they want to spend their time doing. Although this bill in particular was one that drew a lot of attention, and still draws a lot of attention from Democrats and from Republicans. But this process of negotiation, they meet in public, and then they resolve differences by casting votes, by saying, this is the version of the bill that we want. In order for a conferenced bill to be passed back out of the conference committee, you need a majority of the House conferees and a majority of the Senate conferees to sign the conference report, which is a series of amendments and recommendations for how we resolve these differences. Now, the interesting thing about conference committees and conference reports is they come back as privileged. So they're given an up or down vote, a take it or leave it vote. Unlike other processes in the House and in the Senate, where it's possibly subject to amendments, even in the Senate, you can't amend a conference committee without having a conference committee's actions without having to reconvene the conference committee. So really, they're given this sort of pure agenda-setting power, where they can propose an alternative to the status quo, and the Senate says this is what we get, or we get the status quo, and likewise the House says this is what we get, or we get the status quo, and it becomes a way of short-circuiting some of those complicated legislative procedures. And you can think about how that conference committee, why it would be important and why it would be really interesting to people like Shepsley and Weingast, who make it a centerpiece of their theory of congressional organization. They're creating legislation and making proposals that can radically change sometimes the House version or the Senate version of the bill. The other thing to bear in mind here, as you look at this lineup of senators and this lineup of members of the House, is that the people who end up on the conference committee almost always are drawn from the committees that initially proposed the bill in the House and in the Senate. So this process is dominated by those committees that initially made proposals to change the status quo. That's the basis of the Shepsley and Weingast argument, that committees have an outsized influence on this process, not because they make the initial proposal, but because they're the ones that are responsible for making that final proposal, that final unamendable proposal. Okay. So conference committees continued. Getting to a conference is different within the House and the Senate. So the first thing you got to do is you've got to pass a different version of the bill, but it has to have the same number. So remember, we've got these vehicles where you've got HR or S bills, S con res, H con res. These are bills that have to be passed. You've got to pass the same bill with different content. Okay, so we've got this vehicle, and we'll talk about the analogy of that box, right? That we've got a label on the box that's the same in the House and the Senate. It's passed in the same way. That then can trigger a conference committee where we need to resolve differences on that particular bill. The House does it in this way. It says we're going to disagree with that. There'll be a motion where they disagree and request a conference with the Senate. It's a motion that's made on the floor. It's passed, and it can be done in any number of ways. But the technical thing will be, we disagree with the Senate's version of the bill and we request a conference with the Senate. In the Senate, they will insist, request, and authorize a conference. Each one of those steps where we insist on our version of the bill, request a conference committee, and then authorize conferees to go to the conference committee, each of those can be subject to a debate and a vote in the Senate. And you should automatically be thinking anytime there's debate in the Senate, there's an opportunity for a filibuster. So something to realize here is that conference committees, just having a conference committee, is a process that can be subject to a filibuster in the Senate, and frequently was and is. Then there is this process of appointing conferees, and this is really the role of the Speaker and the presiding officer in the Senate. Technically, in practice, the majority leader, who's not the presiding officer, but is the leader of the chamber, is going to be the one who names who the conferees will be and sends them off. But that's also subject to debate and a vote in the Senate. So it is subject to a filibuster. This appointment of conferees happens by the Speaker, although in general, he or she will defer to the jurisdictional committee that initially proposed the legislation in the House. Although, because the Speaker is the person who formally proposes the slate of conferees, these people who will serve on the conference committee, that gives him or her an outsized influence over the content and the preferences of legislators who end up on the conference committee. There's lots of back and forth about this, lots of shenanigans from both the House and the Senate. But, one thing you can do is you can wait and see who they're sending, and then you respond by sending somebody else. And there's the House and the Senate. Make no mistake about it, do not get along very well. When I was working on Capitol Hill as an undergraduate, as an intern, I was working for a House Democratic staff of a committee. In those days, the Democrats were in the minority. And every day, our offices were in the basement of the Rayburn House office building. And every day I would emerge at about 4 o'clock, because I'd been there from 7 until 4 and not left my desk. So I'd go for a walk at 4. And I came around the corner upstairs where there were windows and fresh air in and out of the doors of this building. I come around the corner, I come face to face with the press secretary for the majority staff. He's a Republican. His name was Sam. And I see him and I'm like, ooh, geez, I've got to sidestep and avoid this guy. But he reaches out and he stops me and he's like, hey, you're Dan, right? And I say, yeah, I am. He's like, well, do you know who I am? And I said, sure, I know who you are. You're Sam. You're the press secretary for the Republican staff. And he said, well, why didn't you say something? Say hello. And I said, well, Sam, I work for the Democrats. I'm a Democrat. You're a Republican. This is Congress. And he says, Dan, you and me, we're not enemies. Democrats and Republicans, we're not enemies. If you work for a House committee, there is one enemy and one enemy only, the Senate. So this negotiation between the House and the Senate is one that is incredibly contentious. And they're going to try and exercise every advantage they can possibly get within the context of the conference committee in order to get something closer to the House version and what the House committee wants, or closer to what the Senate committee and what the Senate wants. Okay? So conference committees are this formal negotiation. Conferences deal with large, complex pieces of legislation. So it's not surprising that there's going to be actions taken to try and simplify the negotiation process. So one of those is that there's going to be sub-conferences within the conference committee. These are like subcommittees that negotiate particular pieces of the legislation with the other with counterparts from the other chamber. There's also, because this can be really complex, it's really easy for conference committees to get away with shenanigans. And so the committees will be constrained in theory by instructions to conferees. This is largely a symbolic act where they say, this is what we would like you to do. And the conference then either exceeds or fails to match those instructions. Conference committees are really free agents and they're very unconstrained. Though there will be from time to time, more than these sort of symbolic instructions to conferees, there will be explicit limits in scope. Which is to say, a conference will pass a bill that says, if you exceed this particular limit, the conference committee's actions will be out of order in the House or the Senate. And so any senator could stand up and say, this is a violation of the scope limitations we put on them, and that can kill the conference committee bill. It turns out that those end up being largely ineffectual because, again, this is a take it or leave it offer that the conference is making back to the House and Senate. And they say, look, even though the House wanted $9 billion and we wanted $10 billion in the Senate, and the conference bill comes back with $15 billion for this project, that violates the scopes and these instructions that we've placed on this, but it's the best that we can do. Is that better than nothing? And frequently they say it is better than nothing. So there were lots of problems like this in the 1990s where there were violations of scope. Also, in the House and Senate, in the House in particular, there's still a requirement that amendments that are offered to bills are germane to the topic of the bill. They can't be significantly different from what the bill is doing. So the conference can't drop in, legislation on salmon fisheries in Alaska, which is the example I use in the House procedure lecture. You couldn't drop that in conference and be sure that you wouldn't get an objection in the House. So there's this possibility that someone could object. Although, again, this take it or leave it nature of these proposals from that conference committee make a big difference. And so it makes it really hard for the House or Senate to reject what it is that the conference does. The conference report has to have signatures from a majority of the conferees from both chamber. No minority position is included. So just because you were opposed to the conference report doesn't mean that you actually get to say anything. The chamber that requested the conference traditionally gets the papers first. So if you're the House and you insist on your amendments and request the conference, then you get to vote on what the conference did very first, and then the Senate would go. And the reverse would be the case. If the Senate requested the conference, they get the papers first, vote on this new version of the bill where the differences are resolved, and then send it back to the other chamber. Again, these take it or leave it offers. In both chambers, it's privileged business. So it's not subject to a lot of these procedural processes. And it's really a take it or leave it offer. It's as close to an agenda setter, this pure version of an agenda setter that we've talked about in this class, where you make an offer to replace the status quo, and your offer is the offer, right? No one else gets to make an alternative offer, adjust your offer in any particular way. So these receive an up or down vote. Technically, there is a possibility of a filibuster, but filibusters are often an effort to gain some sort of concession, and there's no opportunity for concessions here. So if it comes back and it's unacceptable, it would just be rejected. Or another version of this is we don't see a lot of filibusters on conference reports. It's probably because these conference reports are anticipating what it is that legislators want, and they're calibrated in such a way that they're not going to receive a filibuster on the floor of the Senate. Given that conference committees occupy the special place within Congress where this coordination problem gets resolved, but also where legislators have the opportunity to be as close to a pure agenda setter as we can imagine in most legislative settings, it raises some academic questions. We want to end this lecture talking about what some of those are, and then we'll circle back to that and talk about how we understand some of this from technical points of view inside the political science literature. So these academic questions are related to something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, this box that is a vehicle in which legislators place solutions to policy problems that they might encounter. And you can imagine that legislation is like a set of tools that legislators are putting into these boxes to send out to become public law. And into this, your only limit is on the tools that you can put in this box is your imagination or your clip art folder on your MacBook Pro. So, think of like a compass or a wrench, tape measure, hammer, some pliers. I think that's a screwdriver. And then Chamber J comes along and says, that's Chamber I has passed this particular set of tools in this box. It's labeled HR whatever or S something. And they send that over to Chamber J, because it can happen. We say Chamber I and Chamber J because it can start in the House or the Senate. It doesn't matter. But the next chamber comes along and says, this is a great looking box. Solves a lot of problems. We've got some really good tools in here, except there's this wrench in here. And this wrench is not the wrench we would choose. We don't like this wrench. Instead, what we like is a different kind of wrench. So we're going to take that wrench, the wrench that you had. I think this is a crescent wrench, until I'm a professor and not someone who uses tools a lot. And I think this is a pipe wrench. I don't know. You can tell me in the comments what it is. So we take this wrench out and we put this wrench in. And so now we have a new set of a new bill, right? This is a different piece of legislation because we've changed one of the tools for something else. This difference, even though it's minor, we've just traded out wrenches, is enough to prevent this bill from becoming law unless we can resolve differences and figure out which wrench it is that needs to go into the final version of the bill. So this difference between wrenches is going to be significant. We talk about these motivating questions. So why is it that Chamber J only changed the wrench? Why is it that they came along and they said, we want to change the content of this bill, but we leave everything else together, and the only thing that we're actually going to change is J. What is it about J that's worthwhile? And then the question for the end game here and thinking about how they resolve differences is when we take the final version of this box and send it to the president with all of these policy tools, which wrench do we get? Which policy tool do we get in the final version of this law and this policy? We're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of those questions next time. That's all we have for today. But we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about coordination problems, we've talked about agenda setting, we've talked about how conference committees occupy special space as both coordinating mechanisms and agenda setters. It's a mistake to think of this negotiation process as only happening in conferences, though, because remember, there's opportunities for straight passage where some of this conferencing happens ex ante or before any actual votes take place in the House or Senate. It's possible that the House and Senate have coordinated on actions and they say we're going to avoid conferences, we're going to avoid ping-ponging, we're just going to pass a bill as it is. Another alternative is ping-ponging, where rather than convene a formal conference, the House passes a version, Senate passes a different version, sends it back to the House, who then makes some adjustments, pass it back to the Senate, and the Senate accepts those, and it goes on. But this back and forth is called ping-ponging or a navette. And then finally, this conference process, which is theoretically important. But what I'll show you next time is that conferences have declined in their use. They're just not used very often anymore. It used to be very common up until about 20 years ago. And starting 20 years ago, conference committees have declined in their usage. And it's an interesting question about why that is. But there's also these more general questions, whether or not it's in a conference or not. Why is it that certain policies get adjusted and others don't? How is it that they arrive at and decide which policy goes into the final version of the bill? All right, we'll take up those questions in the next video. For now, just want to say thanks for joining me, and I'll see you then. I'll see you next time.